Johns Hopkins is an institution that believes deeply in truth-seeking, in evidence-based discovery, and in following the truth wherever it will take us. In recent years, our institution has, through the Hopkins retrospective and other efforts, begun to delve more deeply and critically into our history. This research guided us to a recent discovery of strong documentary evidence that shows that our founder, Johns Hopkins, the Baltimore philanthropist and merchant, was a slaveholder, and that his family had a more extensive relationship to slaveholding than we previously understood. We have a vision at this university of Johns Hopkins very much framed by a man who in many ways appeared to be ahead of his times. We've now had to come to terms with, at least in a very fundamental part of his life, he was of his times. And that's hard.
This past May, the university first heard of the possible existence of a record that indicated Johns Hopkins had 4 enslaved people living in his household in 1850. I was able to find that specific census record in a separate portion, which is called the slave schedules. There are 4 enslaved men listed in his household, and their ages are 45, 50, 25, and 18.
So there on the slave schedule is Johns Hopkins, said to be the owner of 4 enslaved people. And we see at least beginning signs of the ways in which trading in slaves was in part a facet of his business dealings. This was important to us, remarkable even, because we had always understood Hopkins to have been an abolitionist, someone who was radically anti-slavery in his thinking and in his practices. We really are obliged to dig further and to rethink the very foundational narrative that sits underneath our university today.
When Johns Hopkins established Johns Hopkins Hospital, a part of his edict at that point in time was to create a hospital that would not turn anyone away based upon their ability to pay, their race, their gender, and to develop an orphanage in the city for African American children. In a moment in time like this, what's really important is for us as an organization to assure that we understand what this really means, who Johns Hopkins was, the values he articulated in his will, and the context of it.
And we have to acknowledge both things can be true. One can have been a slaveholder, and then imagine oneself the benefactor. One does not negate the other. In the United States, both things can be true.
We know this discovery is important for our community. And that's why we're just at the beginning of this process. Our full community, including our Baltimore neighbors, will be included as we move through this important journey together.
These revelations change our understandings of our founder's life. They do not change the nature of what these institutions represent. At their best, the university and hospital are inspired and enriched by the values and aspirations laid out in our founder's will. They have fueled our institution's promise throughout our history and will continue to do so well into our future.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Johns Hopkins History Town Hall meeting. My name is Katrina Caldwell. I serve as the Vice Provost for Diversity and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer at Johns Hopkins University. It is my pleasure to moderate this important conversation for our institution. My focus is to introduce to you our panelists, also to direct a start of a conversation, and then open up the floor for questions from our audience. There are many reasons why many of you have joined this conversation today. I want to make sure that we centralize the focus on having a dialogue about the news concerning Johns Hopkins, our founder, and his connections to slavery, but also to invite your ideas and input about our collective path forward to learn more about this history. We have a group of individuals with us today who represent our leadership from Johns Hopkins University and Medicine, beginning with our president, Ron Daniels, our CEO of Johns Hopkins Medicine, Dr. Paul Rothman, our president of Johns Hopkins Health System, Kevin Sowers, and we also have joining with us our esteemed Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor and Professor of History and SNF Agora Institute, Dr. Martha Jones. In addition to these top panelists, we also have with us Winston Tabb, whose work has helped bring these discoveries to light. He serves as our Dean of Libraries and Museums. Dr. Jeremy Green, Director of the Institute of the History of Medicine, and Chris Chalenza, incoming Dean of the Krieger School of Arts and Sciences. We also have joining us Allison Saylor, our Program Manager for Hopkins Retrospective. Today, our main focus will be on this important conversation about our history, and secondarily, to get your initial thoughts on next steps. I want to acknowledge that our audience includes a broad group of people interested in this topic, including our neighbors in Baltimore. And we want everyone to have the opportunity to have their questions about the history and continued research to be answered today. But also recognize that although today is really focused on conversations about our history, a moment like this clearly reinforces the need to pursue with intention and speed our ongoing commitments to our strategic diversity, equity, and inclusion work, and the commitments that we have already made to address the legacy that racism that plagues our institution. We spoke about these commitments last summer and again at our Roadmap Town Hall meeting in the spring, and had planned to come back to you in the new year with updates. But we understand the urgency. So we will begin to take up these conversations and offer updates shortly on these topics as we move forward. At this time, I would like to introduce for opening remarks, President, Johns Hopkins University, Ron Daniels.
Thank you, Katrina, and thank you all for being in this conversation today with us. First and foremost, obviously, I, on behalf of the other leaders that are involved in this call today, just want to once again acknowledge the solemnity of this moment and the importance of being open and very rigorous in our exploration of this history that we have uncovered, and to confronting it courageously, unflinchingly, and ultimately to learning from it. That's something that very much guides all of us and how we think about making sense of this information, which obviously was very painful and distressing for us who were vested with the responsibility of leading the institution to have learned. So that's the first thing that I want to communicate to you, and just a strong collective sense of grappling with this history wherever it may take us. I want to also, though, echo something that Katrina said a moment ago, and that is to say that why we are looking at this history, exploring it in an open and careful manner, and learning truths that may be hard for us to understand and accept. We're also determined that we're not going to do this strictly sequentially. That is to say, spend all the time learning history, delving into history, and not simultaneously trying to make change, strengthen the institution, improve its mission today, and to draw lessons from that history. So we're going to be on a parallel track with both learning the history, but at the same time, strengthening the institution, in particular, thinking through the implications of these learnings as we derive them for our contemporary mission. And again, I think this is something that is really fundamental for us in leadership. And that is to say that as much as this history is important, this isn't a sterile, and learning this history is not a sterile intellectual enterprise. What we're really anxious to do is to see how that history has echoes, reverberations to our present time, and causes us to think differently and do differently in today. I just want to, in that respect, just underscore the extent to which the commitments that we have made previously on pay equity and training, as well as doing work on expanding our mentorship opportunities, things that we saw very much of this academic year, that those efforts will continue apace, and we look forward in short order to updating the community on our progress on those efforts, as well, of course, as of our efforts around the development of the next roadmap on diversity, which, as you know, that task force is underway now, and we look forward to the recommendations that that group will make for our university. So with that, just thank you again all for being here, and look forward to your questions, and hoping that we can address the questions and the and concerns, and also receive insights from you on how we best discharge our responsibility to grapple with this hard history.
Thank you, President Daniels. So just to let the audience know, we have received a number of questions in advance through email and social media, and we will also be taking questions submitted live. So we encourage you to please submit your questions throughout the conversation. But I'd like to start with these pre-submitted questions. So first, to Martha and Ron. We've had a number of queries about how you know what you have shared with the community about Mr. Hopkins' slaveholding. How do you know what you are sharing? Is there a bill of sale or other documentation of ownership of the enslaved persons in Mr. Hopkins' household? Ron or Martha?
So Martha, why don't I start and then turn it over to you quickly. And again, recognizing that I'm not a historian and very much have been a student of Martha's and others as I've tried to understand the meaning of this history and to understand the artifacts that we have discovered. And again, really want to acknowledge Martha and Allison for the way in which they have undertaken this inquiry. We, of course, are just at the beginning of our efforts to really understand this history, and there's considerably more research that we need to do. When we learned for the first time in late spring 2020 of the possible existence of the 1850 census document, indicating that Johns Hopkins was a slaveholder, I turned quickly to Martha Jones and to Allison Saylor, who was, as you know, the program manager of the Hopkins retrospective, who had done the initial work to turn the document up in the digitized records of the LDS Church. One of the challenges for us is that the archives, Maryland State Archives, which are the repository of a lot of this information, at least in its original form, has been closed because of the pandemic. So that caused Allison, once we heard that this document may exist, to find other ways to locate it, and locate it she did. Thanks to their painstaking efforts over the ensuing months to investigate and confirm the connections between this document and our founder, Johns Hopkins, we now can conclude that we have strong documentary evidence in the census records that show that Johns Hopkins, our founder, was, in the words of the census record itself, a slave owner. Martha, I think probably with that introduction, turn it over to you to elaborate on how we got to where we got to and the conclusions that you have arrived at and we have accepted.
Thank you so much, Ron, and thanks to everybody on the call for being here today. A couple of framing remarks. The first is that the papers of Mr. Hopkins and of the Hopkins family have not survived as a rich and extensive corpus upon which we might draw. And so that leaves us to rely, as Ron alluded to, on the public record, the census, court records, estate records, and much more, much of those materials held at the Maryland State Archives. Our process is one of assembling shards, that is, small pieces of evidence, which, as they have accumulated to this point and as they will continue to accumulate, will, we hope, permit us to offer our entire community a full picture of Mr. Hopkins and the enslaved people who, it appears from the census, were held in his household. I'll say just a brief bit about how to approach something like a census record, which is, of course, created not for the purposes of this research, is created to, by virtue of the Constitution, determine the number of representatives that the state of Maryland will have in Congress. Enslaved people in 1850, as many of you will know, counted as 3/5 of a person for determining apportionment, while free persons counted as one whole person. So this is the core purpose of the census. And so indeed, we look at the face of the document, the enumerator, what questions did they ask, what responses did they record? And then we begin to contextualize it. One of the things we noticed, for example, is that Mr. Hopkins held one enslaved person, according to the census, in 1840. And that enumerator distinguished between the one enslaved person in the household and 2 free Black people who were also in the household. So we begin to get a sense of the capacity and the charge of the enumerator who is drawing these kinds of distinctions as they interview. We've set that alongside some small but informative pieces of evidence related to the Hopkins brothers' business dealings, where again, we find them enmeshed in the institution of slavery in the context of loans, credit, collecting debt, and more. These kinds of artifacts lead us to draw confidence about the report that the census enumerator leaves to us from 1850. But of course, it doesn't tell the whole story. And we don't know, for example, how these enslaved people were, if you will, acquired by Mr. Hopkins. We don't know enough about the relationships within that household. And as many of you have already asked, we don't know their fates after 1850. One of the cruel dimensions of these documents is that they don't name the enslaved persons themselves. And so our work is ongoing to learn who they were and to discover for all of us not only the circumstances in the Hopkins household, but the circumstances of their lives more generally. So our commitment is to continue to assemble these shards. I thank everyone who has written to us with suggestions, with documents, with leads and more. And we are committed to following all of what you bring to us in an effort to tell this full story. And we appreciate your patience as we continue to do this painstaking work.
Thank you, Ron and Martha. Martha, you alluded to the continued research and work and the contributions for others to add to this process. It brings us up a second question that's been asked by the community. What does this information mean for the university from your perspective? And then I'll ask Ron to follow up. What does it mean for him as president from his perspective? Thank you.
From my point of view, we are at the beginning of dismantling what it turns out were foundational myths about the origins of not only Mr. Hopkins' own life, but the trajectory of his life and ultimately the gift that he makes that establishes this institution. And as we go forward, as Ron alluded to, our questions are not only about this early chapter, but about the legacies of slavery, the legacies of anti-Black racism, and the degree to which those dynamics have and continue to shape our work, our lives, and the contours of our community. So while not all answers lie in the past, I have to say that with humility as a historian, I do believe that the stories we tell about ourselves matter. And this rewriting of our origin story, for many of us, may be challenging. For others of us, and I speak personally as someone who is a descendant of enslaved people in the United States, it brings me to the table in a new way as we think about the future of Johns Hopkins.
Thank you. President Daniels?
You know, I think all of the things that Martha just said are things that I feel very deeply. Let me add just perhaps a few different dimensions to this. You know, one very obvious ramification of this learning goes directly to the role of the university. And as we indicated in our communication to the university, an acknowledgement that a university whose core credo is the truth shall set you free. How did we embrace so readily with such gusto this narrative that right now, from the best we can tell, was not born at the time that the institutions were created. It came later. And as we know, it came, you know, with the publication of a book in 1929, but by a great niece of Johns Hopkins. But what's critical is that for a university that is supposed to be skeptical, supposed to be discerning, supposed to be dedicated to truth-seeking, we embrace something very readily that now it turns out does not appear to be true. And so what does that say about us in our core mission around the exploration and curation of truth? So I think that's an important challenge for us that we have to, again, look at. I think, of course, much in the way that Martha described a moment ago, one you know, wants to understand better this history because, as I said earlier, you feel the reverberations today. You know, in trying to understand sometimes why people react in a certain way for or against some particular issue. You know, in at least some dimension, I think there are these echoes, these ripples of history that are shaping that moment, both in ways that push us to be better and sometimes that hold us back. So I think, you know, a very frank and courageous engagement with this history. And I think it's important, you know, the project that Martha has agreed to lead is not just about the period where we are, the period that predates the creation of the university and the hospital, but we're very much interested in what happens after the creation of these institutions. And in particular, how did we fare during a time of failed Reconstruction and ultimately Jim Crow America? To what extent, you know, do those broader trends in that context, how did we as an institution respond to them? In which ways did we push back against these parts of our history, of which we are frankly now distressed, embarrassed about, and to what extent did we go along with it? So again, I think as we inch ever closer to the present, this history becomes more and more important for us and plays a role in guiding our current decision making. So again, this is why I think it's really important that we embrace the opportunity to grapple very vigorously with all dimensions of this history. And I think for those reasons, this exercise is really important. And again, critically, doing this in a way that involves broad participation of all the communities that are tethered to Johns Hopkins.
Thank you. For our next set of questions, I will direct to Dean Rothman and President Sauer. First to Dean Rothman, how are we interpreting Johns Hopkins' directives in his will and in his letter of instruction to the trustees? Did Johns Hopkins will direct hospital segregation, or was it just carried out that way is the question. Second question, and what does this mean for our path forward?
Thanks, Katrina. Mr. Hopkins' will shows his intent to see that Baltimore citizens of all races receive health care. Also created an orphanage for Black children in the city of Baltimore. That being said, the Johns Hopkins Hospital likely fit in with the accepted norms of that time, in the late 1800s, in which most hospitals in the city of Baltimore were segregated. Additionally, if you look in the letter, it talks about specific wards or buildings that were intended for sick white persons or sick colored persons. At that time in the city, there were a couple hospitals devoted to the care of Black people in Baltimore, but there were many more examples of hospitals across the nation that were refused to take care of Blacks at that time. From its beginnings, Johns Hopkins Hospital was intended to provide care for the poor of Baltimore, irregardless of their race, sex, or age.
Thank you, Dean Rothman. President Sowers, Johns Hopkins institutions have a troubling past when it comes to race relations, including with Henrietta Lacks in segregated medical wards, continuing concerns around building and sustaining trust with the community. Do you see a through line from the institution's namesake to these ongoing challenges?
Katrina, thank you for that question. For me, I came to Hopkins this February 3 years ago. And so I was told the history and the legacy that we now know is not true. And so for me, the fact that Mr. Hopkins had at any time in his life held enslaved people has been disappointing at a personal level and a professional level. Many of you may know my partner, Anthony, is African-American. And so it's created unique dialogue at home and also unique dialogue within the workplace. And so as I think about this revelation for all of us as leaders across Johns Hopkins Medicine and the university, and how disappointed we are, and we also know that it will be challenging for our community. And we must also acknowledge that it's a complex history and a complex chapter in the history of our country, in our city, but also a complex history of our institutions since then. And these legacies raise questions and it causes us to really step back and understand the implications of racism and inequity and how it still may hold true for us as we look and think about structural and systemic racism across our institution and across our country, and how we have to deal with that and grapple with that. But I believe it's a personal imperative for us to pursue the truth. When I think about these findings and what it does, it calls us, I believe, first and foremost, to continue with diligence and openness. And I really appreciate the research that Professor Jones and all the team are engaged in, so that we can understand the full scope of the life of Johns Hopkins. And I think we need to take on these hard questions and the implications of Johns Hopkins' life and legacy over the course of our institution's history and understand the implications for its future. When I think about this examination, it'll also take place within the context of our broader commitment to equity and inclusion, not only in our hospitals and among our physicians and researchers and staff and trainees, but also the work that we are doing within our Baltimore community. And my hats off to Dr. Lisa Cooper, Dr. Shrita Golden, who are really instrumental right now in helping us with looking at health equity and inequities as we approach this pandemic and into the future. It is clear that the anti-racism, equity seeking, and inclusion values we espouse must guide our continued examination into our history and really inform our future, Katrina. And thank you for the question.
Thank you so much for the response. So we've gotten a series of other questions. I'm going to remind the audience to please feel free to place additional questions in the Q&A box. Two questions that have come in. The first two are for Dr. Jones. The question is, how do you do the research of descendants, and how do you go about that research, and how successful can you be? It's the first question. And then the second question is, what can we understand between 1860 and his death in 1873, given that we have documents, for instance, the letters to Lincoln and others?
Thank you. I very much have had the descendants of the enslaved people in Hopkins household on my mind. And I have two thoughts. As a researcher, someone whose work will focus on the 19th century, my work is to search for those essential needles in the haystack that may indeed reveal to us who those people were and the trajectory of their lives going forward, perhaps as they left the Hopkins household, certainly as their lives went forward in the wake of slavery's abolition in Maryland in 1864. And I will continue to be immersed in those haystacks as I discover more than what we have now, which are the demographers' age, color, and sex. At the same time, I think when it comes to descendants, the research is in some sense a two-way street. And I have already been introduced in the last days to Black Marylanders some of whom carry the name Hopkins and within their families have long passed along and valued stories about their origins and their relationship to Johns Hopkins and the Hopkins family more generally. So I hope that partly that work will be a two-way street. And again, I very much appreciate folks who have already come forward and begun to share what they know with us. I think that's essential. How to know more is always a question. And the period between, say, 1860 and Mr. Hopkins' death is no exception here. I think we've already had some success in seeing glimpses of this period of his life through some slim but important correspondence that has survived. We will continue to mine the public record, and thank you again to our friends at the Maryland State Archives who are working with us under the exigencies of the pandemic to continue to increase our access to their holdings. So we've heard from many of you who are experienced researchers, for example, in the vast and very rich holdings of the Quaker Church or the Society of Friends, and we will continue to mine those things. So my comments are just meant to suggest that we've hardly exhausted the available record, and we will continue to work our way through those materials as we patch together that part of the story.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. This question has just come in from President Daniels. Some individuals have criticized the university's decision to release this information. In terms of transparency, others have wondered about the timeline of the release. Why do we think it is important for us to share this finding publicly? And why did it take months to do so?
So let me start first on the question of why do we feel that it's imperative that we release this information? I think on that, it's a very simple answer, and that is that to the extent that we have for almost 100 years communicated a story about our origins, which is not correct, again, as an institution dedicated to truth-seeking. The pursuit of truth is at the core of a great research university. One doesn't have a choice about withholding this kind of information. And to the extent that we held ourselves out as having a history that in fact we did not have or is more complicated, it's imperative that we correct that history. So I really feel very strongly that we were duty bound to do that. In terms of why we did not release this information earlier, one of the first things that I asked of Allison and Martha when we learned of this information, and within a few weeks, Allison had tracked down the documents from the time we first got wind of it, but was to make sure that before we went out and communicated this information, we were absolutely confident that the person named in the record was in fact our Johns Hopkins, and that as much as possible to see what we could learn about the arc of the story that we have long embraced at the institution. And so, things were complicated by the fact that the archives had been closed for the last several months because of the pandemic. But nevertheless, I think we got to a point where, at least from my perspective, and I think from the perspective of Martha and Allison, Winston, and others, that the information was sufficiently ripe, that we were confident in the conclusion that Johns Hopkins was a slaveholder, that we had tested that claim as against competing hypotheses. They didn't hold up. And so with that done, with proper verification behind us, it was time to release it. So I think that the timing was dictated simply by the need to be absolutely confident that the information we were going to share, just knowing how significant it was in fact accurate and verifiable.
Thank you very much. We have a question that is in the vein of where individuals can receive additional information, in addition to where researchers who might want to support our efforts might be able to contribute. So I'm going to ask Dean Tabb if he would be willing to come to answer the question, how is the library making the findings of this research available to researchers? And
thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you for that question. We have a website, retrospective.jhu.edu, which is completely focused on this topic. We have already begun posting there some of the research questions that we're asking, along with documents that we can link to. And so I want to take advantage of this question to encourage anyone who's on the call who actually has documents that they might be willing to share with us to do that, so that we can keep updating on a daily, weekly basis what we're working on and what we're finding. Thank you.
Thank you. We also have questions that are coming in that are asking about the implications, the larger implications in terms of meaningful change. So how is the university going to use this history to bring about meaningful change? Also health systems as well as a question that's been, so I'll open it up to either President Sauer, if you want to respond to that question, or Dean Rothman, if you want to respond, and then President Daniels.
So maybe I'll begin and Kevin can kick in. We have, under the leadership of Sharita Golden, started to implement a strategic plan across Johns Hopkins Medicine that deals with several issues in this realm. One particular interest, I think, to the person who asked the question is really thinking about healthcare disparities, both within our system and in our community. And we have several groups that are seeking to address that by multiple means. Kev, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, in addition to the strategic plan that Sharita has really put together that will move us and advance us forward, we also have to commit to diversify our leadership team and the demographics of our leadership teams across Johns Hopkins Medicine. And that's a commitment that Paul and I have both made moving into the future. And the the requirement for very diverse searches and a commitment to hiring qualified, diverse candidates into our leadership, because that is a missing element that we have to commit to as we move forward as an organization.
Thank you. President Daniels, would you like to respond? If not, I have another historian question for Dr. Jones.
Why don't I just say very quickly, because I want to make sure that the historical questions given the people we've got on this call are responded to. But just in terms of the present and the lessons of this, the ramifications of this for the present, we're involved in a major effort to establish a new set of goals around diversity, equity, and inclusion. That is obviously the roadmap exercise. And at the same time we're doing that, the efforts that we've made over the last several years around faculty hiring, student recruitment at the undergraduate, graduate, and professional levels, the work that we're doing in terms of contributing to the public school system in Baltimore, the work that we're doing in terms of very intentional hiring efforts of individuals from the most distressed neighborhoods in the city, the efforts in trying to create new businesses that are started by local Baltimoreans and particularly by underrepresented minorities. Those efforts, which are underway, will continue, and we'll double and redouble our efforts in that regard. So I think it's important that we recognize the work that has been done, the work that is being done, and the work that we will do, and see this in some sense as a moment in which we can heighten our commitment, but we shouldn't lose sight of the work that's been accomplished to date, and the way in which we've accomplished that work in partnership with so many different segments of our community.
Thank you. Very specific questions to Dr. Jones. What do we know about the reasons and timing and involvement of individuals in the destruction of Johns Hopkins' personal and family papers? Was it a bold event or a common practice at that time?
Thank you. The short answer is we don't know. The papers haven't survived. There certainly were repositories that would have likely accepted them and preserved them, but they were not destined, for example, to survive, for example, at the Maryland Historical Society. And so we can't say more than that. I could point to examples of historical figures who very self-consciously and deliberately destroyed their papers in an effort to, among other things, thwart historians like me who might come behind them and interpret and reinterpret their lives. And at the same time, there are examples of figures like Mr. Hopkins who very self-consciously make sure that their materials are preserved. In this case, what we have is a mystery. I know there are theories out there, but I don't think we have any evidence of what happened to the papers.
Thank you. Another question in that vein, and Dr. Jones, you can answer this, or maybe a larger institutional question. Will anything be done to memorialize these 4 people who Johns Hopkins enslaved?
So why don't I just say something quickly about the efforts to acknowledge, memorialize those individuals, and then turn it over to Martha to talk about what more, if anything, she can say about efforts to actually identify these individuals and their descendants. One of the things that we have done has been to indicate that the committee that we have struck to advise us on how we explore this history, what are the next steps we take, how do we do it, how do we bring in lectures, how we have events that will acknowledge this history. These are things that we will all look forward to receiving advice and counsel on from the committee that is being chaired by Martha. At the same time, though, I think those of us in leadership at Hopkins know that at some point, and again, it'd be good to do this when we can do it in person rather than virtually. I think it would be useful to contemplate the creation of some kind of event moment in which we can acknowledge this history and to acknowledge the individuals who were enslaved to Johns Hopkins. But I think we want to know more before we go to that event, because I think as we learn more about these individuals and maybe even can put names to them and names to their descendants, I think it will become that much more meaningful. So that's the hope, and the precise nature of that event, the nature of other memorialization of those individuals, again, I think is something that we'll look to the committee to advise us on, but we're open to doing just that.
I'll add from my part, as a historian, my version, if you will, of a memorial or a tribute to these individuals comes in the form of articles and books rather than public rituals. And at the same time, I would offer up that we already know enough about them to acknowledge them, to honor them, even if we never learn another thing about them and their particularity. I do want to acknowledge incoming dean of the Krieger School, Chris Chalenza, who brings to our working group the lessons learned at Georgetown University, where he has been dean, to our process. And so I am confident that we have the insight and the resources and the commitment to that kind of justice and to that public acknowledgement. And I look forward to working on that.
So Dean Chalenza, you've been called to the floor. I just want to invite you. I know many of you, this may be the first time meeting him virtually. So if you wanted to just say a few words in way of opening or in response, that would be great.
Yeah, thank you. No, I appreciate the work that's been done so far, and I appreciate the spirit of openness and the openness of the communications about it. And I also just think it's important to acknowledge the pain that many members of our community must be feeling. And to state that I think that there's a limit to what we can understand as individuals, and that the goal going forward is going to be to understand this as a community. A university, of course, is a community of students and scholars on the one hand, but we're also a community of many staff members from all over the city, and we're a community that's embedded in another community, the community of Baltimore. And so I think that as we go forward, there's going to be a lot of specific things we can do. We'll have academic initiatives. I think we should have public-facing conversations about these revelations. But I think the most important thing, right, is to keep understanding that there are people in the past like Mr. Hopkins who were thought of as good people at the time, who thought of themselves as good people at the time. And then lo and behold, we look back and we see that, a crime against humanity was tolerated, right? And so I think what that has to let us do is to try to think about where are we in the present now, and especially when it comes to racial equity and specifically anti-Black racism, which has had such a shaping effect in the United States. What kinds of things are we ignoring? What kinds of things are we maybe not prioritizing? And how do we leverage the contributions and the conversations of that larger community to understand those possible lacks in our knowledge, and how do we get beyond that and work together to go forward? So I'm as moved, I think, and as disappointed as anybody by these revelations, even as I know that the foundational character of the university is strong, and that the pursuit of truth will be strong, and that we'll pull together and we'll look for the truth together, and we'll go wherever the truth leads us. So thank you.
Thank you. This next question, I will ask President Daniels to determine whom he would like to address it. He may want to address it initially I know, President Daniels, that you spend a great amount of time talking to our Black faculty, staff, and students. I know you make yourself available to groups and answer questions and address concerns. We have a number of questions that have come in, and I can, again, open this up to all our leaders. What would you say to this group? So you have an opportunity to address this group directly on this call. What would you say to them? I know we've talked about our plans moving forward, our the structures, the process, the programs and initiatives, but just the one you person to those persons, what would you say to them?
I think first and foremost, it would be a plea for continued collaboration, for being open to conversation and be open to participation in learning more about, but ultimately building a stronger institution. And I know for so many people, the revelation of this part of Mr. Hopkins' life is devastating. And I know that there may be at some level, as some have said to me, well, we knew it, we knew it all along, that the story was too good, too perfect. But having said that, it's also really heartening when people say, despite the pain that this causes, and it reminds us of a set of roots of this institution and the city and the state and the country of which we're part. We still are part of the institution, and we want to work with you and hope you will work with us to make it better. And so I guess for me, that willingness to continue to be open to collaboration, to building the institution that will learn from and grow, take strength from this moment, I think is what I'm really hopeful that people will hear from me, and in turn I pledge as president to do my very best to be able to move the institution in a direction that genuinely takes these lessons seriously and doesn't just treat this, as said before, as an intellectual exercise, but as a moment where we can do repair.
Thank you. President Sauer or Rothman, would you like to respond to that?
Katrina, before I would say anything to the group, I've learned the value of listening first. And since the announcement has come out, I have listened to a variety of responses. Much as President Daniels spoke to, I've had emails from employees and also had discussion with members of the faculty who have said to me, I'm not surprised. How could he not have had enslaved people during that time? And yet for others, it's been hard because there was this legacy and story that people held on to, that we were an organization that was different because of the man who founded and gave the money to found our organization. So there's a variety of responses, but I think after listening, I, much like Ron, would commit to making sure that we've learned from those lessons and that we examine where we have structural and systemic racism within our institutions and how we address that so that we can be a better organization in the future. And it's going to take all of us coming together to do that. It can't be just a small group of people who make that happen. It really is the collection of all of the elements of our organizations coming together to assure that we do the right thing for equity and anti-racism moving forward.
Thank you. And we have one final question, and then I'm going to start wrapping us up for close. Dean Tabb, if you can respond to what can we learn from other institutions that discovered negative things about their founders' past? How did they address the past and how did they address their path forward?
Thank you. There is an organization headquartered at the University of Virginia called Universities Studying Slavery. And Johns Hopkins has become a member of that group. There are roughly 70, I think, universities, both in the United States and abroad, and sharing information about what we've learned, but also about processes. How do you go about uncovering some of the kinds of information that we're looking forward to? So Professor Jones will be our project leader with the universities studying slavery. We have the example from Georgetown already alluded to, but we know we have many things to learn from others, such as Brown, Columbia, at Harvard, and so on.
Thank you. We have a number of questions in the chat about path forwards, the research effort. I want to assure those, if we did not get to your question today, that we will have meaningful responses to those questions on the websites that were named earlier in the broadcast and that were also attached to the original community announcement. I want to allow our leadership to give closing remarks, and then I want to end with Dr. Jones giving the final words. So anyone from leadership who'd like to give a closing remark, and then we'll let Dr. Jones close us out.
Why don't I let my colleagues from East Baltimore go first, and then I'll speak before Martha.
So I think Kevin said it very well. I think, you know, our goal here is to take this history that we're learning more about and use it to make us a better institution today. I mean, when I talk to faculty here, that's what they want us to do. And so that's why we're so thankful for Martha, Jeremy Winston, and Chris, the group who's going to help lead this. And then it's up to leadership to take these lessons and apply them and improve us today. So,
Kevin, do you want to chime in before I do?
Yeah, thanks, Ron. First of all, I want to thank everyone who's joined the call today, because I appreciate the fact that so many have come together to really share in this moment and have in this dialogue. But I would remind us that, because I want to thank Professor Jones and everyone else who's involved in this, that this will be a journey. It is not a sprint. Because we didn't get here overnight, and we're not going to make the changes or have all the understanding that we need to have in the next month. And so I appreciate everyone's patience as we work together to advance a better organization and a better institution as we learn more about our history.
Let me just, building on what others have said, and just acknowledge that unlike virtually everyone who's on this call today, you've only had a limited amount of time to assimilate this news and to begin to make sense of it. I, on the other hand, have been living with this as well as a small coterie of other people who have been investigating this for several months. And as you can imagine, you go through waves of distress, despondency, pain, but also I must say it's taken me to a point now where I actually feel quite excited about what is possible from this moment and from the information that we're addressing, and actually remain fundamentally optimistic about what we can learn, not just from this, but from other aspects of our history. And to see that from those learnings comes the possibility of real progress. And so the entreaty I would have for our community is, very much building on what Kevin said a moment ago, is this is going to take some time, but it's also going to take us to approach this moment with open hearts and open minds. And we're going to need to learn more, to explore more, to address difficult issues, but ultimately to build a better place. And I think that's an exciting and indeed is an entirely constructive and I think ultimately uplifting opportunity that we have before us. And I hope that we can use it to its best.
Thank
Martha.
you, Dr. Jones.
I want to leave everyone with one plea, which is please join us. That we cannot do the work alone. We cannot meet this challenge alone. I invite you all to, in a sense, be part of a seminar writ large that we run in the history department in the Krieger School called The Black World, where with my extraordinary colleagues like Dr. Jessica Marie Johnson, these are questions, these are research challenges, these are ethical and political concerns that each week on Tuesday afternoon in the Black World Seminar, we have been grappling with. We now have an opportunity to build out that seminar and include the whole of our university community, our Baltimore family, and in fact, the world. And my only plea to you is to join us, to help us shape that seminar, to make meaning, to take purpose out of what we've discovered, and to see what we can make of it. So thank you, everybody.
Again, I want to thank you all for joining us. Remind you to follow the efforts through Hopkins Retrospective and Hard Histories. The leadership and our historians are interested in speaking with you. As I was once told, my mother would always remind us, truth has many faces, but justice does not. We will not only be judged by how we treat people today, we'll also be judged by how we treated people yesterday and days before. Thank you again, and we welcome you to join this conversation and our efforts as we move forward as an institution committed to truth and justice. Thank you.